Welcome everyone to today's webinar on PWS Clinical Trials. This is Susan Hedstrom, the Executive Director for FPWR, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today. As you may know, there are many PWS clinical trials recruiting this year, and we anticipate more than 500 patients will be needed to fill these studies. I applaud all of you for learning about these studies and thoughtfully considering if participating in a trial might be right for you and your family. If I could just do a quick little audio check. If you can hear me okay, could you press the raise your hand button so I can see? Perfect. Thank you, Devin and Sarah. I appreciate that little audio. Today's webinar is jointly hosted by both PWSA USA and FPWR, and you'll hear from both Rob Lutz, member of the PWSA Board of Directors and father of a teenage girl with Prader-Willi syndrome, as well as Dr. Teresa Strong, FPWR's Director of Research Programs and mom to a young man with PWS. To get everyone ready for today's presentation, let's take a quick poll. What is, let's see, there it is. What is your interest in participating in a clinical trial? Is it low, medium, high, or undecided? Go ahead and take a few seconds to go ahead and select an option. I'll give you just 2 more seconds to get in there and tell us what is your interest for participating in a clinical trial. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share some results. So clearly, you know, our interest is a little bit off, is a little bit everywhere here, which is perfect for today's webinar. So today's webinar, we're going to take about 30 minutes to cover information about what to expect while participating in a trial, as well as details on specific trial opportunities. We do invite you to submit questions throughout the presentation using your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll answer as many of your questions as we can at the end of the presentation. The webinar will be recorded and made available through FPWR and PWSA USA's media channels. So now I give you Rob Lutz, who will share the benefits and risks of participating in clinical trials, as well as what to expect when participating. Rob?
Thanks, Susan. I appreciate it. I want to start just for 10 seconds, introduce myself a little further. So I have an 18-year-old daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome. She's uniparental disomy. And we live outside of Philadelphia. And the reason I've been asked to help with this is that I work at a small biotech company, so I'm in the pharmaceutical industry. And although I'm not a clinical expert, my job experience has given me some insight into how this works. And so if we can go to the first slide, Teresa. It's a very exciting stage. When I started my Prader-Willi journey, my daughter was first diagnosed at 6 months of age. There was really very little in late-stage clinical development in terms of treatments for Prader-Willi syndrome. And today we have the exciting prospect of more than 5 drugs in later stage development. And the challenge that brings is that in order to have those drugs approved for wider use, they need to have trials conducted that support the efficacy and safety of those drugs. And in turn, that requires volunteers from the community. And that's an important thing to think about, and I'm excited by the poll to see that many people are looking into it, and we hope to provide great background on that today so that people can make a better informed decision. So to start, we thought we'd share a little bit about the way drug trial development works. Teresa, if you could actually go back to the previous slide for 1 second. Thank you. We won't spend a lot of time on this. There's a lot to digest here that people can look at later in the webinar files that get sent out. But drug development is a very long process. It starts with some very basic research, where this is very much in the lab. It goes on to preclinical development in the second stage, which requires more work on toxicity and animal testing at times. And then there's actually, even after that, there's 6 to 7 years of clinical development on average in humans, starting with what they call phase 1, where there's testing in healthy human volunteers, very short testing typically, just to make sure that there's no safety issues with the drug. Then it moves into the important stages of phase 2 and phase 3, where there's further detail on the doses, on the efficacy, and on the safety over a longer term and with a much wider audience to ensure that if the drug is approved for use, that there's no surprising side effects or dangers to the drug, and that actually the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks of those side effects. As you can see depicted in the diagram, on a typical drug, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers needed to participate in those trials in phase 2 and phase 3. And in the case of a rare disease like Prader-Willi syndrome, that number is much lower, probably in the 50 to 200 range per trial. But still need, given the size of our community, we still need a number of volunteers to work this out and make sure that we get the data we need to ultimately get to the FDA review stage and then to one or more approved treatments. So that's just a little background that we wanted to provide so you can understand how this fits in. And as I said before, the good news is that we now have a number of drugs in that phase 2 and phase 3 time frame, and that means we're getting close potentially to treatments. But we need to help with the process by volunteering and supporting these clinical trials, and so we want to provide background on how to do that. So Teresa, now if you go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. So one of the major reasons that clinical trials are delayed or fail is due to that insufficient number of participants, and we clearly, as a community, we don't want that to happen. The faster and more complete we can enroll these trials or help enroll these trials, then the sooner we'll all have the answers or further questions to ask down the road. And so to help people make decisions about whether to participate, we're going to provide more background on what that means. We're going to provide information on other links and resources for people to review to make even more further informed decisions. Teresa will add background on the drugs that are in development and the different types, different ages, different requirements for those trials, so people can learn more about that. And as an important note, these are important decisions. It's a big decision. We can't emphasize that enough. And so we have to always consult your physician and carefully consider your options when making this decision. Next slide, please. So we thought we'd lay out some of the benefits and also some of the risks at a high level of participating in a clinical trial. So in terms of the benefits, as I've already alluded to, there's the potential for access to new beneficial treatments immediately for your child or adult who would participate in these trials. So if you or your loved one joins a trial, they would be in a program and could actually receive the benefits of a drug right away. The risk of that, of course, is that there could be side effects, or in some trials there's a placebo, so they could participate, go through all the effort, and not immediately get on the drug that may be useful. So those are some parts of what you need to consider. The beauty is that we need this data both to ensure that any drug is successful, and also, even if it's not, it's important data to help us learn more about what doesn't work and how we can further improve those drugs, further eliminate options, and move it forward. So whether it works or not, there's still very important learning to be gained from any clinical trial. In terms of the cost, there's no insurance required. Costs of the medication, costs of the visits and the tests and the care are usually covered. So that's a benefit of participating in a trial. And oftentimes, travel-related expenses are reimbursed. On the other side, there is a significant amount of time and energy that can be involved in participating in a trial, so that should be carefully considered. And reimbursement doesn't include things like time taken away from the job, typically, lost work, or the energy involved. So again, there are some costs covered, but there's also there's some costs that just can't be reimbursed for these trials. These trials are designed that they don't want to induce people by paying them a bonus or an incentive to participate in trials. So there's very strict rules about what can be reimbursed. So again, consult your physician or with the investigators of the trial if you want to learn more about that particular element. Next slide, please. So now we'll take a second to walk through kind of the 4 major steps involved in participating in a clinical trial. There's a screening stage, a consent stage, the study schedule, which is really the study itself, and then a follow-up and reporting phase. So with the next slide, we'll look at the screening first. So the screening stage is a part of this very much up front, where the study coordinators, typically, or the principal investigators of the trial, will evaluate whether a particular volunteer should be included in the trial. So they're screening in or out of the trial. They'll look at things like demographics, so some trials have age or weight specifications that need to be met in order to participate. Sometimes they look at genetic subtype. They'll gather some information on clinical features. There'll often be an examination, so they'll look for general health and try to rule out patients who may have some morbidities that would prevent them from participating, like diabetes or high blood pressure, that might rule them out of a clinical trial where they're still learning about a new medication. And lastly, they'll want to understand the various drugs that are currently being taken by a potential participant. If your Prader-Willi loved one is like mine, there are multiple drugs that they're on, and so those have the potential to interfere in particular trials, and so they'll evaluate that. So this is all designed to prevent extra danger, extra risk from patients who would have an interaction with a drug, with another drug they're taking, or to have a health condition that makes them higher risk. So there's really very little involved at this stage except some paperwork and maybe an examination to ensure that it's an appropriate volunteer for that particular trial. Next slide, please. So then, based on that examination, if you've been screened in or your loved one has been screened in, then there is an informed consent stage. So given the risks involved, there's a very careful consideration to making sure that participant or a guardian is fully informed about the risks of the trial and the benefits of the trial. And so there's a stage of providing consent. And there's a legal definition here that consent is a voluntary agreement of an individual or his or her authorized representative who can give consent, exercises free power of choice without inducement and without any other form of coercion to participate in research. So that's a very technical definition. What that means practically is that a participant and or his or her guardian have gained the information they need to fully understand the study. They've been warned and told about all the various risks. They've had all their questions answered. They understand what's required to participate, and then they would agree to go ahead or not based on what they've learned. And so, importantly, it's also good to understand that informed consent is ongoing. You can always withdraw from a trial or change your mind at any stage if, for whatever reason, there's concern about the way it's going or concern of the effect on you or your Prader-Willi volunteer. So that's just a very legal stage, but also very important because that's when consulting with your physician and with your the care team for any particular Prader-Willi individual, there needs to be agreement that to go forward both legally and with all the requirements of the study. Next slide, please. So assuming that someone is screened in and provides that consent, then they go into the study. And the study has typically a series of visits to the physician who's participating in the study. And they usually examine the patient as they would in a doctor's office. They often take blood. They do other tests that are useful for data collection purposes for the study. And those are used to evaluate the safety and the efficacy of the drug that's being tested. Usually, after an initial baseline visit, drug or placebo is given to the patient and taken on a regular basis. And then there's usually frequent visits in the beginning to make sure that the drug is both safe and starting to be evaluated correctly, and maybe perhaps titrated. And then oftentimes the pace of the visit slows down. So they may be weekly, every other week in the beginning, and then they often slow down to once a month or more as the trial continues. But important to note that there will be a fair number of visits required typically, and we would urge everyone to understand that schedule up front in terms of any coordination that's needed depending on how far away the site would be and depending on schedules and the like. So as I mentioned, there's a variety of metrics collected on efficacy. So in other words, they would look at the weight of the participant, the body composition, so meaning the mix of muscle and fat and the like. And there's often sometimes questionnaires about hyperphagia or about quality of life or about the opinion of a caregiver. And so that's all collected to document whether or not a drug is working or not. There's also a lot of safety information collected. So typical things like blood chemistry, blood pressure, and behavioral assessments to make sure that there's nothing untoward or dangerous going on. And then there's some more technical things collected as well, like pharmacology. So often there's some blood draws to just look at the levels of the drug in the blood to see how it's being absorbed patient by patient. So the visits lead to that data collection, which is ultimately what's used to evaluate any drug, and that's what the FDA looks to approve a treatment or not. And that's ultimately what doctors will look to decide if it's an appropriate treatment if a drug is approved. And so that data, those statistics are used, and that's the heart of the study, if you will. Next slide, please. After that is really the follow-up. So the results of a study typically eventually get published in a medical journal, whether it's successful or not. Some studies will report directly to patients. Many will not for various reasons of confidentiality and the like. Oftentimes, before those results are published, these trials are what's called blinded, so that neither the patient or the caregiver or the doctor, the principal investigator involved, know whether a patient received the actual drug or a fake placebo drug, because they're trying to keep that objectively compared so people can tell whether the drug is working or not compared to a non-drug, if you will. Clinicaltrials.gov is a website Teresa will talk about further that will often share the results of the trial as well. And we hope over time that, we've seen this in the past, there'll be opportunities for the results of these trials to be shared directly to us as the Prader-Willi community. So with that, I believe that we've come to the end of this sort of first informational section, so I'll turn it back over to Susan for the next steps.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for giving us an insight as to what to expect when participating in trials. Just a reminder, if there are any questions for Rob or our next presenter, you can submit your questions at any time through the GoToMeeting control panel. There is a place for questions. You just type your question into the panel, and it'll be sent right over to us, and we will answer those questions towards the end of the presentation. Before we move on to our next speaker, I'd love for us to take another quick poll. So this question is asking, how confident are you that you can find the information you need on PWS clinical trials? Are you very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, or I have no idea where to begin? Let us know. We'll just take another second. Give as many people as possible an opportunity to vote. All right, and here are the results. This is great news. We've got quite a few people who are very confident or somewhat confident. I'll say that I don't know about you, but I often feel like I need a cheat sheet in order to understand all of the trial terminology. Both FPWR and PWSA USA are working to help our community and you access the information they need to make informed decision on trials. So in the next half of this webinar, Dr. Teresa Strong will review with you where you can find information about PWS clinical trials and the resources that are available to you, as well as a brief overview of the clinical trial opportunities that are currently available or upcoming. Dr. Strong?
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Rob, for that introduction to the clinical trials. So in this part of the talk, if I can get it up, we want to give you a little bit more information. Even though some of you know where to get some information, hopefully we can give you some additional information that will be useful to you as you consider whether or not to enroll your loved one with PWS in clinical trials, what questions you might want to ask, and who you should ask those questions of. So both PWSA, USA, and FPWR have information on their web pages about these clinical trials. So you can find on PWSA USA under research announcements. Rob has developed a really nice table that lays out the different drug studies side by side and the characteristics of those studies so you can compare them all in one place. There's also some terminology as well as a couple of sentence summary of each of the trials under this table. FPWR also has a table that it has a click through to a description of the clinical trial and also clicks through to the clinical trial record on clinicaltrials.gov. Clinicaltrials.gov holds all of the records for all of the clinical trials that are going on in the US and around the world. And that information is provided by the drug companies themselves. So it's a little bit more detailed information and not as user-friendly, but that's where a lot of information is. On the FPWR page, you can also sign up for Clinical Trials Alert, which is an email alert as clinical trials open and as new sites open for clinical trials. You can also check the Facebook pages and the emails both from PWSA and FPWR. We try to keep you updated on clinical trials as they become available. And if you're in the global PWS registry and you have clicked contact me for clinical trial information, we will send you information on clinical trials that you may be eligible for. So we'll send you that information, you can review it, and we'll have the contact information of who you can contact to get more information. We've mentioned clinicaltrials.gov. Again, this is sponsored by the National Library of Medicine. It has all of the clinical trials that are ongoing for PWS. You can click on the recruiting and not yet recruiting studies to get the ones that are going on now, and use the search window to type in Prader-Willi syndrome, and you'll get a list of all the clinical trials that are going on. Again, it's around the globe, and you can click on each one, and it'll give you eligibility criteria, how the trial is designed, and also which sites are recruiting currently. So to find out if there's a site for a particular trial that's near your home. So then, who should I be asking questions? Well, if you're, as a starting point, if you want to understand the trial as it relates to your child, it would be great to talk to your primary care physician or maybe the endocrinologist who follows your child, because they know your child best. But if they're not directly involved in a clinical trial, they may not know the specifics of the logistics nor of, the study drug itself. So if you're interested in learning more about the logistics of the trial, the procedures, who's going to reimburse me, where do I park, those are questions for the study coordinator. So on the clinical trials record, it'll have the site, and it should have contact information by phone and email of the study coordinator. If you're looking for a more in-depth discussion of the potential benefits and risks of a specific trial, the physician who is running the clinical study at that site has that information. So the drug company that's sponsoring the study will give them all of the known information about the drug, what clinical studies have been done to date, what are the potential side effects, what are the potential benefits. And so that is a discussion you can have with the study coordinator and the study doctor to really gain an in-depth understanding of that. In thinking about what questions you should be asking, of course, I'm sure you have some, but it's helpful to look at these websites from the National Institutes of Health and clinicaltrials.gov, which have some questions that you might not have thought of that are good to include in your list of questions that you'll want answered. These are great sites, but they're not the most patient-friendly sites. For that, there's a nonprofit, the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. They've got some great videos, informative videos about clinical trials. They've got frequently asked questions and a question list that you can download and print out and take with you to the clinical trial site. So I'd recommend that as well. As the trial proceeds, there may be additional people who you want to talk to. Again, the study coordinator knows the logistics. If some concerns pop up during the course of the clinical trial, you'll want to talk to the doctor at the site who's running the trial. As you go through the informed consent process, you'll get the contact information for the director of the local IRB. That'll be on the informed consent form. If you have any concerns about how the trial is being conducted, that would be a person that you could contact. We wouldn't expect that to happen, but they're an independent person who oversees all clinical trials at that medical center. And keep in mind that the FDA monitors safety throughout the trial. So all side effects by law have to be reported to the FDA. Serious side effects have to be reported in a timely manner, and they have to be shared with all the clinical trial sites so that everybody can be keeping an eye on those. If you have a serious concern about the clinical trial, the first person to talk to is the physician at that site. If for some reason you're not comfortable doing that, you can talk directly to the FDA. Again, we wouldn't expect that, but it's good to know that the option exists. And again, as Rob had said, it's not ideal because we'd like everybody who enrolls in a clinical trial for statistical reasons to stay in, and so that the study team can determine if the drug is safe and effective. But of course, for your personal situation, if you have a concern and you feel like you want to withdraw from the clinical trial, you're allowed to do that at any time with no negative consequences. So let's go over at a very high level now the clinical trials that are coming online or have come online recently for PWS, and we're specifically looking at those trials that are pretty much for 2018. We know there's additional clinical trials coming down the line. We're looking forward to those as well. But today we're focusing mainly on trials that are starting in 2018 and that are mainly in North America. I do have this Tesomet trial here. That's an ongoing trial that's being performed in the Czech Republic. I won't talk about that except to say we're looking forward to hearing the results of that trial. But we'll go through very briefly these other studies that are mainly US and Canada. So the first two trials are looking at the oxytocin system in PWS, and there's been a lot of excitement in the PWS field about the role of oxytocin. We know that there's a deficit in the neurons that produce oxytocin in the brains of individuals with PWS. And we also know that oxytocin influences hunger, it decreases appetite and promotes satiety. It also enhances and improves mood and trust and love. And so the idea is that because individuals with PWS have low oxytocin in their brains, if you give them intranasal oxytocin, you may recover some of that ability to regulate their hunger and regulate their emotions better. So there are two clinical trials that are either recruiting or about to recruit in the US currently. There are additional trials in Europe, but one in the US that has just started recruiting is at Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx in New York. This is a phase 2 trial. It's an 8-week trial. It's randomized, placebo-controlled, so some kids will get drugs, some kids will not. There's no body BMI restrictions, so this is for all kids, whether they're overweight, normal weight, whatever weight. And it's for kids age 5 to 17. There's another trial that will be starting likely this fall from Levo Therapeutics looking at carbetocin. Carbetocin is an analog of oxytocin, which means that it's similar to oxytocin, and it engages the oxytocin receptor, but it engages it slightly different and maybe more specifically than naturally occurring oxytocin. Some of you may have participated in the phase 2 study looking at carbetocin and PWS that was run by Ferring. Those results are due to be published very soon, and My understanding is that they were encouraging, and so Levo has picked up this drug and will be looking at it in a phase 3 study. This will also be a randomized placebo-controlled study, but it will have an open label extension period. That means after that randomized period, which is probably around 3 months, all of the participants, whether you received placebo or drug, can go on and receive drug in the open label extension. I believe in this case it will be for about a year. Again, there's no restriction on kids can be normal weight or overweight or obese, and there'll be multiple sites in the US and Canada, maybe other sites internationally, and the study will be for children aged 7 to 18. There are 2 other studies that are targeting both appetite and behavior both through different mechanisms. One is from Insight Therapeutics, which will look at CBD or cannabidiol. And the rationale here is that the endocannabinoid system, this is a system that impacts appetite, mood, and pain, among other things. We know that that's altered in PWS. And so CBD is expected to decrease appetite and improve mood in this population. So this is a phase 2 trial that has just started recruiting. It'll be a 12-week randomized placebo-controlled trial. There is the option for an open label extension as well in this trial, no body BMI restrictions. I believe the first site has opened in Tacoma, Washington. There will be additional sites, so please, again, check back or be checking your emails, and we'll share with you as those additional sites open. Diazoxide is being tested in a controlled release formulation by Soleno Therapeutics. So this is a drug that has actually been used in a condition of kids who have way too high insulin levels. So there is an experience of using it in practice. So it has a pretty well-defined safety profile, which is an advantage. And it is thought to act on these particular channels in the neurons in the hypothalamus that regulate hunger. So the idea is that this drug will engage those channels and it'll bypass some of the deficiencies in those neurons that regulate hunger in PWS. An interesting thing that came out of the phase 2 study that was carried out was that there seemed to be a decrease in aggressive behavior, that, those temper outbursts that we sometimes see in PWS. And of course, that would be a welcome effect of the drug as well. So a phase 3 study is being recruited now to extend and hopefully confirm those findings. This will be a 15-week study. You can see the other aspects of the study here. It is for children ages 8 and up, and there will be multiple sites. The first site actually just opened this week at Seattle Children's Hospital, but there will be probably more than 10 sites throughout the US for this trial. And finally, there are 2 trials that are targeting the hunger hormone Ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone that is increases before every meal. It makes us hungry, and in PWS, we know that it's abnormally high. So there are 2 compounds that are acting in different ways to try to decrease or interfere with the high levels of Ghrelin that we see in PWS. The first is a compound by GLWL, a phase 2 trial that is recruiting currently in the US and Canada. And this is a drug that interferes with the enzyme that makes Ghrelin the activated form, or the form that makes you hungry. And that is for individuals aged 16 to 65. The second study is a drug that you may be familiar with. You may have heard of AZP-531 that was tested by Alizé Pharmaceuticals in Europe in a phase 2 trial. That study was published and showed some encouraging results about decreasing hunger. And that drug has now been picked up by Melendo Therapeutics, and it's been given a new name, levolitide. And towards the end of the year, Melendo will open a trial of about 100 to 150 individuals aged 12 to 65. That trial will be in the US and Europe to, again, see how this compound alters the balance between the active and inactive forms of Ghrelin in a way that they hope will reduce hunger in PWS. So in addition to those drug trials, I'll just mention very briefly, and you can get more information on this page, there are a number of non-drug trials. So if you're unable to participate, if your child or loved one with PWS is not eligible for some of these drug trials, there are many other ways that you can support the clinical trial effort in general for our community. Everything from a mindfulness intervention to teach adolescents and adults with PWS how to manage their temper outbursts better. So if you have an adolescent who's got some anger management issues, you might want to enroll them in this web-based intervention to learn mindfulness. If your child poops, Andrea Hack is interested in characterizing the microbiome, and you can send her your child's poop in the mail, and she'll be excited to get that and analyze it. And I'll talk about two quick studies, the Weight Study and the Registry, and wrap up. So we're just starting a study to look at what is the natural variation in weight in individuals with PWS who are just going about their lives. So this information, I think, will be really important as a reference for all of these studies that are going on. So these new studies are looking at drugs that hopefully will decrease appetite, but it's good to have a reference population of, what is that natural variation, so that when we compare these drug studies to people that are out in the world just managing PWS as best they can. And the great thing about this is it's entirely text-based, so we'll send you a text every week asking what your child's weight is. That will be aggregated anonymously with hopefully about 200 others who have kids and adults aged 12 and up, and we'll get a sense of the natural variation in weight in PWS. So you can sign up for that study, which starts June 15th through this website. And finally, I just want to mention the Global PWS Registry, which I hope many of you are enrolled in. We now have more than 1,400 people participating, so thank you if you're one of those individuals. If you're not participating yet, I would strongly encourage you to join. This is a platform, it's a web-based platform in which we ask you many questions about your child's medical history and development and things along those lines. It will allow clinicians and all of us to learn more about what the full spectrum of PWS is, what's the natural history of PWS, or what are the normal complications and how often do those happen. We're also using the registry to get information about the patient perspective in the drug approval process. So the FDA is very interested in what patients and families view as the most important things to treat, and what is the impact of PWS on the individual, for example. And we're gathering that information through the registry so that the FDA can make a really informed decision when weighing the benefits and risks of any drugs. One example of that, some of you filled out the impact of PWS on caregivers survey through the registry. If you did that 6 months ago, it's time to go back in and do your second time point, so look for that email. Another thing that we're using the registry for is to develop new measures for clinical trials. We know kids with PWS have a lot of anxiety, but there's actually not great measures for looking at that and using that to see if a drug is positively impacting their anxiety. So Levo Therapeutics is interested in developing a new measure of that, and we'll be doing the testing through the registry. So please, if you have an extra hour, I know you're very busy, but if you can set aside an hour, register at the Global Registry, fill out some of the first surveys and get all set up so that when that anxiety measure comes to testing in the next couple of weeks, you'll be in there and ready to contribute to that effort. And the registry also allows you to have a running history of your child's medical complications, and also, as I said, will update you on clinical trial opportunities. So that brings us back to our challenge that Rob mentioned, that, one of the major reasons that clinical trials are delayed is this participation. We really hope that you will, as a result of this, webinar and then, the follow-up to it. If there are things we can be doing to help you learn more information, please let us know. But hopefully these resources will help you learn a little bit more about the trials that are going on and find the ones that your child or loved one may be eligible for. We ask you to speak to your doctor or medical professional about them, speak to the medical team at the site, and get all your questions answered. So we'll really sort of strongly encourage you to do this. Of course, the final decision about enrolling or not enrolling is something that is, you need to make the decision that is right for you and for your family, because it is, an investment of time and effort. But I think, I'm always cognizant of the fact that my son really benefited from access to growth hormone at a young age, and the only reason that he was able to benefit from that was because some other family took the time to learn about clinical trials and growth hormone and participate in a clinical trial so that the drug could get approved and so that, my child could have access to it. So I think we'll end there, and hopefully Susan will let us know if we have some questions. Here's our contact information. You can contact Rob, you can contact me, you can contact both of us, and I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Thank you, Dr. Strong, for telling us more about these trial opportunities. At this time, we're going to open up the webinar to Q&A. We will answer as many questions as time allows going to the top of the hour. If you do have a question, you can submit it through the GoToMeeting control panel. You'll see a chat section that is listed under questions. You can simply type your question in there and submit it to us, and we will go through, again, as many as we can up to the top of the hour. Teresa, I want to start with a very important question, which is regarding the ages of eligibility. Are all of the studies aimed for children, or perhaps you could point out the studies that are available for adults?
No, there's several that are open to adults. So for example, the GLWL is for adults. The levolitide, which will be coming online towards the end of the year, is open to adults. The diazoxide is age 8 and up, so that includes all adults. Some of the oxytocin ones for now are really focused on children as well as the CBD. I think from the oxytocin standpoint, it seemed like from the phase 2 studies that the best response may be in the younger population, and I think that's why the studies are focusing on that population. But there are many trials that are open for adults.
So I think you just answered this other question, which was, will the oxytocin trial be open to people with PWS who are older than 17?
So the trial, at least this trial, the oxytocin and the carbetocin trials that are opening will not be open to adults at this point. And again, I think that's because the companies are trying to focus on the population that is most likely to show the beneficial effects. If a drug gets approved, and Rob may want to weigh in on this, then there can be additional studies, or there can, the drug may be prescribed for additional populations moving forward. But the initial studies are in these populations to give it sort of the best shot to get approved and on the market.
Great. Are families eligible to participate in clinical trials outside their countries? So can Canadians come to the U.S. to participate in a trial and vice versa?
I think that's a complicated answer that really depends on the study and needs to be discussed with a study coordinator. Rob, I don't know if you have additional information about that.
Yeah, I don't think so. If there's no study site in a particular country, I don't think that cross-border participation is allowed. It's worth investigating because I'm not 100% sure, but these are very carefully regulated things, so I don't think that'd be likely.
Okay. Here's another question for us. If we participate in a drug trial, are we guaranteed to receive drug at some point?
So if there's an open label extension, then then yes, barring any, restriction in that open label extension, usually anyone who participates in the trial can then participate in the open label extension if they choose to, and they would receive drug at that point. For some of the phase 2 studies, it's just the randomized study and then the study is complete. So you really have to look at the individual study, but what you'll be looking for is, or what you would like to ask about is there an open label extension?
And there's a follow-up question here. Is the open label extension, how do you find out if the company is offering that?
Well, I think that both, I know it's on the PWSA site on that table that Rob put together. I think he's got that in there. It's the clinicaltrials.gov record will often have it, and the best way to confirm everything is to talk to the study coordinator.
Okay. And for those of us who are perhaps just starting to look at clinical trials, can you define what an open label extension is? So
that's it. Sorry, did you want to answer, Rob?
Sure. I thought maybe it makes sense to take a step back just for a quick second. So in a clinical trial, most of them in the phase 2 and phase 3 they like to compare the effect of the drug versus the effect of a placebo. Placebo, most people probably know, is just a fake pill or fake injection that looks exactly like the drug, but it has no effect. It's in essence water or sugar water or something to that effect. And so the reason you do that is because there's the risk of bias. If investigators or participants know that they're getting an active drug, sometimes they think that there is a benefit, and they think that things have changed, and that, believe it or not, the mind can actually encourage that kind of result. So the way to control for that, and this is actually called controlled clinical trials, is to have a placebo, what they call placebo arm, so a group of patients or participants that get placebo, and then a group of patients that get the active drug, it's called. And so usually there's some type of structure to the beginning of a trial where there are people are assigned randomly to either a placebo arm or to a active drug arm. And sometimes that's 50-50. Sometimes there are more arms or more patients in the active arm, so you have a better chance of getting on drug. So again, that's something that would be on clinicaltrials.gov or can be, asked through us or through the principal investigator or the study coordinator. So there's that oftentimes that active phase that's placebo-controlled, and then in many studies, not all, in many studies, they stop that phase in order to collect additional information about the performance of a drug. There's what they call an open label extension. In other words, everyone knows it's open. Everyone knows that they're getting the active drug. And that's done because they're not comparing to placebo anymore, but they're looking for safety information typically, and to have more time on the drug to make sure that the effect continues and that they learn more about it. And so, as Teresa said, that's not true in all cases, so it's important to follow up, look at the clinical trial detailed information, or ask the study coordinator exactly how it's going to work. But I thought that background might be helpful for people to understand how that works in terms of whether they'll get the drug or not eventually.
Thank you, Rob. That's incredibly informational. We do have a question here. Teresa, you're on the perfect slide. So can you explain the difference between oxytocin and carbetocin, and perhaps indicate why you would choose one over the other?
So I'm not going to get into choosing one over the other because I think that's a conversation that you should have with your doctor. But I will try to address some of the differences. So oxytocin is a naturally occurring hormone, and this is a synthetic form of that that engages the oxytocin receptor, and it has many effects on the body. Oxytocin also at higher levels engages other receptors, and so the difference between oxytocin and carbetocin is that carbetocin more strongly engages the oxytocin receptor and doesn't engage other receptors. Now, there are some who will say that oxytocin is a better choice because actually it has, it engages the receptor in sort of the way it was meant to engage it, and it has broader effects. There are some who favor carbetocin, and their argument is that it is more specific for the oxytocin receptor. Sometimes if you get to high levels of oxytocin, you engage the vasopressin receptors, and there's a theory that that may cause a little bit more aggressive behavior as you get to very high levels. And that was seen in at least one study run in Australia by Dr. Einfeld, that at very high levels in older individuals, there was an increase in behaviors. So it really depends on who you talk to. I think there's strong arguments that can be made for both oxytocin and carbetocin, and I think in part it depends on, your child with PWS and, their characteristics. And I think that we don't know which one is better for PWS. And so hopefully these studies will resolve that issue. But I think the reason we're doing these studies is because we don't know for sure what works best. Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
No, well said, Teresa.
Great. We have a couple more questions coming through. How about, I've called the site, but no one has returned my call. What should I do?
So I think it's important for so I would say call again. And we really hope that all the sites will be very responsive to our population. It's important. Our time is precious too. And so I think the sites are generally very good about getting back to us. So if it continues to be a problem, I think, we're happy to pass that information along to the sponsoring institution so it can, institution or sponsoring company so that it can be addressed. But hopefully that was just a one-time blip in the system, and they will get back to you soon.
Great. For our participants here who are not currently eligible for clinical trials, how often should they recheck on clinicaltrials.gov, or when can they expect to get emails notifying them of new trials that are recruiting?
Well, if you're signed up for the clinical trial alert, you should already be getting those. Where is that? Oops, there it is. So you should already be getting those. If you're in the registry, we're starting to send those out now. We haven't sent them out yet, but we're starting to do that because we've had a lot of trials that are have opened in the last few weeks or are opening now. So I would say, one or both of those would be great ways to stay on top of it. And then with respect to checking clinicaltrials.gov, I think it's unlikely that aside from this list, there may be one more clinical trial coming on in 2018. But I don't think there's going to be anything popping up during the summer in addition to these ones. At the end of the summer, towards the end of the summer, there may be some new opportunities. So I guess I would check back, every couple of months. But if you're signed up on either the clinical trials alert or in the registry, we'll also notify you directly as those trials open.
The clinical trial alerts email does go out monthly. In fact, we have one that's scheduled to go out this week. So if you're signed up for that email list, you will get the notifications. If you're not signed up, you're welcome to join the list. I've provided a couple of links to all of you in the chat box if you haven't found that box yet. I've given you links to PWSA USA's website so you can find their recruiting table. I've also provided the link for FPWR's clinical trials page so you can view the table there. That's the same page that you can sign up for email alerts if you're interested in those. I have a question here asking, are these emails geographically based? The answer to that is no. We do not limit the information that we provide you. We simply allow you to know what trials are available so that if you wanted to travel to trials, you could. I'll say we are keeping in close contact with the companies as they're opening up new trial sites. For any one of the trials that Teresa has shared with you today, we don't have a full list of all the trial sites yet open. So as they continue to add sites and make them available, we will let you know as well. We'll add them both to the clinical trials table that Teresa has shown you several times today, as well as we'll add an update in the clinical trial email alert. And let's see, I'm reading questions as I'm explaining this. So not sure if Rob covered this in his explanation of what an open label extension is, but can study participants always find out if they received the real drug or the placebo at the end of the trial?
Typically not until the data is fully released, so it could take a while after the completion of a trial. At some point, though, I believe that information can be made available to individual participants so they can understand.
Is that a requirement of the company, Rob? Do they have to give us that information, or is it something they do as a courtesy?
It's a good question. I actually don't know if it's required or not, but I think from a healthcare consideration perspective, it would be important for people to get that information so they could understand if they had efficacy on a drug, whether they were actually on it or not, or vice versa, whether to try it if they weren't. So I believe that information should be available. Again, at the appropriate time, this information is to be, unblinded, is what they call it, when the company finally learns which patients were on drug and which were not. That's a very important stage, and everything has to be very carefully kept secret until that point, and then that information is released thereafter. So it would not be right away.
Okay. Right, and I think there are some health privacy considerations. I know, at least during the entire conduct of the trial, which is much longer than the end of the trial, the company sometimes, they don't even have access to, to who has been on the trial and not. So it's kind of a third party just to maintain that real wall of patient privacy.
We do have about 2 more minutes to answer any additional questions that may come through. So if you have a question you'd like to throw out to our presenters today, please go into your question panel and type out a quick question for us. This webinar has been recorded. We will make it available to all of you. When you registered, we were able to collect your email. So an email will go out later today or first thing in the morning that will include a link to this recording, so that you can go back and access any of the information that's been presented. And again, all of this information is available on both PWSA and FPWR's website if you're looking for specific trial information. Okay, it looks like we're at the end of our question queue, so I'm going to go ahead and sign us off. And thank everyone for coming today. I hope that you had some of your questions answered and are feeling like you know where you can go in order to find more clinical trial information. Have a great day.